This is video 2 for APUSH for Friday, April 10th. Confederate conscription. Just a second. Alright. Confederate conscription also created class conflict. The government allowed the wealthy to hire surrogates to perform military service in their place and exempted anyone from who owned more than 20 slaves from military service on the grounds that the large plantations these men ran fed the Confederacy and its army. In effect, the wealthy did not have to serve, while the poor had no choice. As a result, class tensions increased, leading ultimately to widespread desertions from the Confederate Army. Toward the end of the war, it also led many Southerners to small towns to ignore the government and to try to carry on as if there was no war. Many resisted when asked to feed, clothe, or in-house passing troops. The Civil War and the Union. The Northern economy received a boost from the war as the demand for war-related goods, such as uniforms, weapons, spurred manufacturing. The loss of Southern markets harmed the economy at first, but soon the war economy brought about a boom period. A number of entrepreneurs became extremely wealthy. Many succumbed to the temptation of greed, overcharging the government for services and products, or war profiteering. Some sold the Union government worthless, shoddy food and clothing, while government bureaucrats looked the other way for the price of a bribe. Corruption was fairly widespread and eventually prompting a year-long congressional investigation. Like the South, the North experienced a period of accelerated inflation, although Northern inflation was nowhere extreme as its Southern counterpart. In the North, prices rose between 10 to 20% annually. In the South, the inflation rate was over 300%. Workers worried about job security in the face of mechanization and decreasing value of their wages formed unions. Businesses, in return, blacklisted union members, forced new employees to sign contracts in which they promised not to join unions, and used violence to break the strikes. The Republican Party then, as now, believing that government should help businesses but regulate them as little as possible, supported business in its opposition to unions. Lincoln, like Davis, oversaw a tremendous increase in the power of the central government during the war. He implemented economic development programs without waiting for congressional approval, championed numerous government loans and grants to businesses, and raised tariffs to protect union trade. He also suspended habeas corpus in the border states to make it easier to arrest secessionists, especially Maryland. During the war, Lincoln initiated the printing of national currency. Lincoln's able Treasury Secretary, Salmon Chase, issued greenbacks. Government issued paper money that was a precursor to modern currency. Emancipation of slaves. As previously stated, neither the Union nor Confederacy initially declared the Civil War to be a war about slavery. The Constitution protected slavery where it already existed, and so many opponents, including Republicans, were opposed to the extension of slavery into new territories. As a presidential candidate, Lincoln had argued for gradual emancipation, compensation to slaveholders for liberated slaves, and the colonization of freed slaves somewhere outside the United States, perhaps in Africa. When the Union dissolved and the South left Congress, Lincoln was faced with a legislature much more progressive in its thoughts on slavery than he was. The radical Republicans wing of the Congress wanted immediate emancipation. To that end, the radicals introduced the Confiscation Acts in Congress. The first, in 1861, gave the government the right to seize any slaves for use for insurrectionary purposes. The second, in 62, was much wider in scope, allowing the government to liberate any slave owned by someone who supported the rebellion, even if that support was limited to paying taxes to the Confederate government. The Second Confiscation Act, in effect, gave the Union the right to liberate all slaves. This act had little effect, however, because Lincoln refused to enforce it. Soon after, however, Lincoln took his first cautious steps towards emancipation. The primary reason was pretty simple. Slaves indirectly supported the Southern war effort. They grew the crops and cooked the meals that kept the rebel troops fed. Therefore, any strategy the Union Army had adopted had to include capturing slaves as a key element. But what to do with them once they were captured? Lock them up somewhere and return them to their owners after the war? They had to be freed, or the government or the United States would become the world's biggest slaveholder. And there were other advantages of making the freedom of their slaves one of the side effects of the Union victory. One was that it kept Britain and France out the war. Jefferson Davis had hoped that these countries would support the Confederacy in order to keep receiving shipments of Southern cotton. But once Lincoln made it explicit that Union victory would mean freedom for the slaves, European governments dared not to attempt to come to the aid of the rebels for being in fear of being quickly toppled by an outraged public. Another advantage was the emancipation would provide a new source of troops for the Union side. The bare sight of 50,000 armed and drilled black soldiers on the banks of the Mississippi would end the rebellion at once, Lincoln mused. But he dare not make this move until after Northern victory, lest it appear like a desperate response to the defeats skilled Southern generals were inflicting upon the Union. The moment came in September 1862 with the Union victory at Antietam. In the aftermath of the battle, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Note, the Emancipation Proclamation, for all its intents and purposes, actually freed no slaves. Instead, it stated that on January 1st, 1863, the government would liberate all slaves residing in the states still in rebellion. Throughout the war, Lincoln refused to acknowledge secession, insisting on referring to the Confederate States as those states in rebellion. The proclamation did not liberate the slaves in the border states such as Maryland, nor did it liberate slaves in the southern counties already under control of the Union Army. Again, legally, Lincoln had no power to abolish slavery in areas governed by the U.S. Constitution. Abolitionists complained that the proclamation liberated slaves only where the Union had no power to enforce emancipation and maintain slavery precisely where it could liberate the slaves. The proclamation also allowed southern states to rejoin the Union without giving up slavery. On the positive side, the Emancipation Proclamation finally declared the Civil War was for the Union, a war against slavery, and thus changed the purpose of the war, much as the Declaration of Independence had changed the purpose of the Revolutionary War. Also, it inspired a lot of African Americans to end up joining the Union Army. Not until 2 years later, while campaigning for re-election, did Lincoln give his support to complete emancipation. Just before the Republican convention, Lincoln lobbied for a party platform that called for a constitutional amendment prohibiting slavery. The result was the 13th Amendment. After his re-election, Lincoln considered allowing defeated Southern states to re-enter the Union and to vote for the 13th Amendment. He tried to negotiate a settlement with Southern leaders along those lines at the Hampton Roads Conference. Lincoln also offered a 5-year delay on implementing the amendment if passed, as well as a $400 million in compensation to slave owners. Jefferson Davis' commitment to complete Southern independence scuttled any chance of that compromise. We're going to stop the notes there. Let's go look at the key concepts real quick. Remember that we finished up Units 1 through 4. We're now going to Unit 5 in the course guidebook, which is basically the Mexican-American War to the Civil War. Okay, I didn't cover any Unit 5's concepts, so we're going back all the way to Manifest Destiny 5.2. Desire for access to natural and mineral resources and hope of many settlers for economic opportunities or religious refuge led to an increased migration to and settlement to the West. Advocates of annexing Western lands argued that Manifest Destiny and superiority of American institutions compelled the United States to expand its borders westward to the Pacific Ocean. Western migration was boosted during and after the Civil War by the passage of the new legislation promoting Western transportation and economic development. U.S. interest in expanding trade led to economic, diplomatic, and cultural initiatives to create more ties with Asia. The United States added large territories to the West, even though the victory in the Mexican-American War, diplomatic negotiations, raising questions about the status of slavery, American Indians and Mexicans in the newly acquired lands. U.S. government interaction and conflict with Mexican Americans and American Indians increased in regions newly taken from American Indians and Mexico, altering these groups' economic self-sufficiency and cultures. The Mexican Cession led to the heated controversies over whether to allow slavery in the newly acquired territories. The courts and the national leaders made a variety of attempts to resolve the issue of slavery in the territories, including the Compromise of 1850. Substantial numbers of international migrants continued to arrive in the United States from Europe and Asia, mainly from Ireland and Germany, often settling in ethnic communities where they could preserve elements of their languages and customs. A strongly anti-Catholic nativist movement arose that was aimed at limiting new immigrants' political power and cultural influence. The North's expanding manufacturing economy relied on free labor, in the contrast to Southern economies dependent on slave labor. Some Northerners did not object to slavery on principle, but claimed that slavery would undermine the free labor market. As a result, a free soil movement arose that portrayed the expansion of slavery as incompatible with free labor. African American and white abolitionists, although a minority in the North, mounted a highly visible campaign against slavery, presenting moral arguments against the institution, assisting slaves' escapes, and sometimes expressing a willingness to use violence to achieve their goals. Defenders of slavery based their arguments on racial doctrines, the view that slavery was a positive good, and the belief that slavery and states' rights were protected by the Constitution. The courts and national leaders made a variety of attempts to resolve the issue of slavery in the territories, including the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, but those ultimately failed to reduce conflict. The second party system ended when the issues of slavery and anti-immigration nativism weakened loyalties to the two major parties and fostered the emergence of the sectional parties, most notably the Republican Party in the North. Abraham Lincoln's victory on the Republicans' free soil platform in the presidential election of 1860 was accomplished without any sectional electoral votes. After a series of contested debates about secession, most slave states voted to secede from the Union, precipitating the Civil War. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and I'll pick up military conflict in the Civil War later on in the next set of videos. So y'all have a good day, have a good week.